And then they had a day of reckoning where they couldn't put it off any longer. And luckily, it came sooner rather than later, because had it come later, it would have been even more probably cataclysmic and more difficult to transition from an apartheid state to a state that is on the road toward trying to create something resembling democracy, and in many ways doing it as well as we've done it now. But, you know, I think that's the problem, is we haven't had that conversation. And part of what I try to do in my work, and what I encourage others to do, is to talk about the consequences of not addressing privilege. And I think once whites come to understand that those consequences are more deadly, more destructive, more painful, then we'll face the thing that's in the mirror confronting us, because it's easier to confront that now. It's all that's, you know, it's you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And if you pay me now, we can maybe deal with this thing. If you pay later, it's hard to tell.
We're already paying for it now. I mean, everybody watching 9/11 have it in front of them, so we're paying for it now. But let me expand a little bit further. We talk about dialogue and diversity, but the thing that opened my eyes a few years ago is I had a friend say, I hate talking about diversity.
Yeah.
And I asked her why, and she said, because you don't talk about diversity in anything but black and white. And there's more than black and white people out there.
Right, of course. No, I think it's critical that we understand, both in a global context, the way that white supremacy is played out. The system of white supremacy is simply a system of white over non-white. I don't like the term non-white because it takes whiteness for the norm, but you know what I mean when I say it, that's why I'm using it here. And a system of white over non-white just means anybody that doesn't qualify for whiteness is, in some sense, behind the curve of opportunity, and that means whether, in this country, whether one is black, Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, Native American, Arab American, anything other than whiteness. Now keep in mind, whiteness also morphs over time and shifts, and who qualifies for membership has shifted too. Right, so whiteness is not this constant, and of course it's not, because it's not a biological thing. It's not a scientific thing. It's scientifically a fraudulent concept, but it has cultural meaning, so people get to be honorary white folks for a while, and then we become real white folks. The Irish became white, Italians became white, Jews became white, and there's a real big attempt right now on the part of, I think, some within the power structure of white America to co-opt people of color into honorary whiteness. Right, because you can't do it all by yourself, man. You got to have some black folks that play your game, some Latino folks that play your game, some Asian folks that play your game. Try to get them on board, because there just aren't enough white people to keep the ship, you know, going in that direction. Yeah. So white supremacy is a system that affects all people of color and affects whites, divides us from one another. This historically divided white working class from working class people of color who have common interests, but made white folks think that their skin was more important. So we do have to have a conversation about what is being done in this country to all people of color. Those housing discrimination figures, for example, that I mentioned, that's not just discrimination against black folks, that's discrimination against Latinos and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous, Native peoples, Arab Americans, the job discrimination data, the Blum-Rosen study, that's all people of color. So we need to be very clear about that. And I got to tell you, one of the recent stories, I just want to mention this, when the Virginia Tech shooting happened, for those of you who follow my work, I've written a lot about the white school shootings that were almost all white shooters for many years. And then we have Virginia Tech, which was a Korean-American young man that committed that crime. And of all the dialogue that took place, and this just goes again to show how blindness and that bubble of stereotypes that sometimes we find ourselves in, I think makes it really a dangerous world. Here's a young man from the time that he was in 5th grade, which is when he came to the United States, had regularly engaged in selective mutism. And I don't mean he just was quiet. I mean, he would go weeks and he just didn't talk. There are people who never heard him speak. And it's evidence of profound psychological dysfunction most of the time when you engage in selective mutism. But no one ever intervened, no one ever sought help for him. He'd been in schools for years, and no teachers ever thought, we maybe need to do something about this. So this young man, we find out later, of course, college professors were all of a sudden, alarm bells were going off, we need to do something, and by the time they began to act, it was too late. I'm wondering, and I can't prove this, but it's something we really ought to think about. I'm wondering how many of those teachers that he had in Fairfax, Virginia, or wherever it was he was, the part of Virginia where he was, almost all the teachers are white in the school system. I'm wondering how many of those teachers from 5th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th had looked at this young Asian man, and instead of seeing profound psychological dysfunction because of how quiet he was, instead saw a stereotype and thought nothing of it. Because Asians are quiet. Like, that's the stereotype. Smart, he does fairly well in his grades, but more importantly, he's quiet. And that's the stereotype that a lot of folks have about Asian and Pacific American, Pacific Islander men and women. So if they're quiet, that doesn't, that's just culturally appropriate behavior. So that's a stereotype. I don't know that was in their mind, but I'm wondering because it's a very common stereotype, and it might be the very stereotype that kept them from intervening with this young man and ended up resulting in people dying. This is how dangerous this stuff is. It's not just dangerous for Joe. It was bad for him because it allowed him to go in the direction that he went, but it ended up being bad for everyone. So we've got to really think about the cost of not confronting this and just sort of acting like it's not a big deal.
We're going to start opening this up to you. The forum is really for you to ask questions of Tim. We just want to make sure that we have microphones on either side of the room. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll get the microphone over to you. And we'll put out just the one right here.
The question that I would ask is, how does classism play into all of this, if at all?
Well, I think that white privilege and white supremacy have been the transmission belts of false consciousness for working people, to use a term that's sort of Marxist in orientation, but whatever. It's a good term. Classism as a system has been maintained because working class people of color and working class white folks have not, to this point, gotten together, recognized their common interest, and moved to really change that system and radically transform it. And the thing that has kept that unity within the working class from moving to transform that system and to really alter that system fundamentally has been white privilege. So these two things are interrelated because one has maintained the other. Were it not for white skin privilege, that working class unity may have come about. But what happened, for those who know the history, it's critical to know this, that in the colonies of what would become the United States, in the 1650s, 60s, and 1670s, first of all, there was no such thing as the white race at that time. It didn't exist. European people existed, but we didn't consider ourselves one big happy family. We'd been spending all of history killing one another. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. There was no such thing as the white race to describe Europeans writ large as one big umbrella group. But in the colonies, when indentured servants who were European, who were basically just one level above a slave, and African indentured servants who were not yet permanently enslaved by the 1630s, 40s, 50s in most places, began to see they had commonality of interest, they began to foment rebellions against the elite, the landowners, the aristocracy, realizing that they didn't have anybody's interest at heart. None of the landless peasants, white or black, quote unquote, were in their minds as being important. So they realized that they had an interest in overthrowing aristocracy, but the aristocracy got very frightened, of course, by the sight of this unity across lines of African and or European descent. So they began to create these terms like the white race. And now you take all these Europeans who you don't really like and you make them part of your team and you let them get out of indentured servitude. You end up abolishing indentured servitude for European people at the same time that you're implementing permanent enslavement for African people. And you say, by the way, not only are you free now, white people, but we're going to give you 50 acres of land in Virginia when your term of indenture is over. And we're going to put you on the slave patrol to help us keep them in line. So in other words, the elite told the working class European peasants, you don't have much, but you got this, and this makes you part of our team now, and they fell for it. Because when you don't have any other property, this becomes pretty good. If that's all you got, you will cash that check. And so it divided those working class coalitions. It maintained the class inequity. Fast forward to the Civil War, people in my part of the country, and apparently some in yours, because I saw a Confederate flag in the back of a truck 10 minutes before I got here, at a gas station down the road. I didn't come 800 miles to see that, but I saw it. Right? People in my part of the country now talk about, oh, the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. But see, back in the day, we didn't have any shame about it, so we just said it like it was. So if you go back and look at those secession conventions, the only reason they ever articulated at the time for why they were seceding from the Union and prepared to foment war if necessary was to maintain the institutions of white supremacy and the enslavement of African people. It was the only rationale they ever articulated. Not once, at the time, did they give another one. That was the reason. But then the rich folks didn't want to go do the fighting, so they got poor white folks to do it for them. Now that's a hell of a trick, because the poor white folks didn't own any slaves. Now how do you get somebody that doesn't even own slaves to go fight so that you can keep yours? What you do is you tell them, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, they already have your job. That's the point, because if I'm white and I got to charge you $1 a week to work on your farm, and you can get the black guy to do it for free because you own him, who's going to get the job? Not me. So in fact, slavery undermined the wage base of working class white people. In class terms, it was not a positive thing for most whites, but in race terms, it made sense, and so we stuck with it. The union movement, same thing. Union leaders who said, we can't integrate the union to bring down the quality of the workforce in the working class. No, it'll double the size of your union, fool. And if you don't bring them in, the boss is going to hire them.